First, let me please introduce Professor Williams. And Professor Williams, you can start maybe sharing your screen. Okay, so Professor Williams is a professor of public policy at Sheffield University Management School at the University of Sheffield in UK. He is a lead expert to the European Commission's European platform tackling undeclared work. And I would say that he is the best expert in the European Union to discuss the nature of undeclared work and ways to tackle it. According to ResearchGate, Professor Williams has something close to 800 publications, which shows that he is really very respected and very demanded researcher. To be honest, like, my view is that his papers are probably my favorite ones because they are very well written, they are very well structured, and from perspective of a reader, they are quite understandable. So if you want to read about something about undeclared work, you should find papers of Professor Williams. And finally, I also want to add that he is a friend of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Once he invited me and Professor Humanna to University of Sheffield, and we visited it. It was a quite fruitful meetings and visits, so we hope for future cooperation as well. Finally, Professor Williams, I thank you for accepting my proposal and to speak in front of our students. We discussed that you will speak about measures to tackle undeclared work, and maybe you will share some interesting cases. You will speak for about 40 minutes, what did we plan, and then we will have a Q&A session.
Okay. Can I start?
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see the one slide?
Yes, we can.
You can see the title slide, yeah?
Absolutely.
Okay, just checking. So there's the title. What I want to do, and thank you for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be back in Ukraine virtually, if not in reality. So measures to tackle undeclared work. What I'm going to do is define it. What does it mean? And then talk about the policy approaches. And as Oksana said, I work for the European Commission and the European Union and the 27 member states, advising them on how to tackle undeclared work. So most of what I talk about will be in relation to the 27 countries in the European Union. Let's start off with what it is. Well, there's an official definition, and it says that it's any paid activities that are lawful, legal, regarding their nature, and the only thing which is illegal about them is that they're not declared to the public authorities. So they're not declared to the tax authorities for tax purposes, for paying taxes. They're not declared to social security institutions for paying social security, social insurance contributions, and there are violations concerning labour law, such as minimum pay, hours worked, etc. Slightly more refined definition is that it's socially legitimate work that is legal in all respects besides the fact that it is not declared to the authorities so as to evade tax, social security contributions, and to evade some labour laws. I know that Friedrich Schneider spoke to you last week about the shadow economy. What's the difference between the shadow economy and undeclared work? Well, the only thing which is illegal about this work is that it evades tax, social contributions, and some labour laws. The shadow economy is different because the goods and services themselves can be criminal, can be illegal. So here, they're legal goods and services which are provided, but they're just not declared for tax, social security or labour law purposes. With the shadow economy, that also includes illegal goods and services. So human trafficking, trading in illegal drugs, trading in firearms, etc. And that's the major difference. So what are we talking about when we talk about undeclared work? Well, the first thing to say is not an activity. So cooking is not undeclared work, or housework is not undeclared work. Computer repair, car repair. Any task can be done using different types of work. So let's take the example of the first one on the list, cooking. Cooking. You can undertake cooking unpaid for yourself. It's the normal way to cook, and that is unpaid self-provisioning by yourself, for yourself, and sometimes members of your family. You could also cook on an unpaid basis for others. Somebody comes round to have dinner with you, or you've got an elderly neighbour next door who cannot cook for themselves. So that's a form of unpaid community exchange. You can cook for a formal job. So that's declared employment as a chef in a restaurant. But you can also cook as undeclared work. If you cook as a chef in a restaurant and the money you earn, you don't declare. So the first thing to say is that undeclared work is not an activity. It's a relationship between an employer and an employee, or between a buyer and a seller. So what types of undeclared work are there? What are the major types? Well, first of all, there's wholly unregistered or undeclared employment. So you have no contract, no written contract of employment, no terms of reference, and the money you earn is not declared to the tax authorities, and you make no social contributions. And in most countries, it's illegal to be engaged in employment without a written contract of employment or terms of reference. On the other hand, undeclared work can also be undeclared self-employment. And there you're self-employed, working on your own account, but you don't declare transactions you engage in, monetary exchanges, for tax and social security purposes. And then there's also undeclared employment. So you've got a formal employer. The formal employer pays a formal employee an official declared wage, but also an additional envelope wage, which is undeclared. And they do that to evade paying their full social insurance and tax liabilities. There's also a situation when a formal employer will underdeclare the number of hours you worked as a formal employee, so as to evade paying the minimum wage, if there is a minimum wage in a country. So you can do undeclared work as an employee, and it can be wholly undeclared or underdeclared, and you can do undeclared work as a self-employed person. But always only in relation, we only discuss it in relation to the legal goods and services. If they're criminal, illegal goods and services, that's the shadow economy, which we don't discuss when we talk about undeclared work. So how do you tackle it? And what choices have you got? There are actually 4 hypothetical options. First of all, you can do nothing about it. Just leave it. So a government will decide, well, let's do nothing. Let's not touch it. What would be the consequences of that? Employers could continue to exploit employees and pay them low wages. Employees will not have any entitlement to pensions or unemployment insurance if they're made unemployed, etc. And if you accept work on an undeclared basis from people, such as from self-employed people, then you may not have any rights if they do a bad job. So if they put in a new cooker for you and then you're electrocuted and end up dead, then you may have no insurance come back on them to prosecute them, or your family will have no, if you're dead, no right to prosecute them. So that's one option, do nothing. It's not generally pursued because most governments see it as negative, the undeclared economy. Another option is to transform all declared work into undeclared work. So get rid of all laws concerning employment in work, get rid of tax laws, get rid of health and safety laws, occupational health and safety laws, get rid of minimum wages, get rid of any rights at work. And if you do that, you transform all declared work into what is currently called undeclared work, where there are no rights and no entitlements. So you could just get rid of everything to do with labour law, tax law, social security law, and transform the whole of the declared economy into what's currently called the undeclared economy. Some Latin Americans had the idea of doing this, a guy called Hernando de Soto. It's not to be advised, really, because our taxes pay for health services, universities, schools, hospitals, roads, etc. It's quite useful to have a declared economy because then we can collectively pay for public goods and services such as schools, hospitals, health services, roads, etc., etc. Police, ambulances, fire engines. Third option, eradicate undeclared jobs and businesses. So when you find them, close them down, get rid of them. Great, yeah, that's a good idea. Indeed, it was the dominant idea for the past 40 years in most of Europe and most of the world. The trouble is, and I'll give you one example, globally, 2/3 of all businesses start up in the undeclared economy. Because nobody has an idea for a business one evening, and then the next morning they set up a 100% legitimate business. I mean, it's impossible. Everybody slowly legitimizes their business when they start it up. They engage in a transition towards legitimacy and formality. So if you closed down all those businesses when you saw them, you'd get rid of 2/3 of all entrepreneurship, plus you'd destroy the enterprise culture. And most countries look to the enterprise culture and entrepreneurship as the route to economic development and growth. Unfortunately, as I say, for 40 years, that was the standard approach. And also workers. I mean, if they're found to be working undeclared, they don't want their jobs destroyed. They want them to be transformed into declared work. So, fourth and final hypothetical option is the option which is now accepted. That when we find undeclared work, we should transform it into declared work. When we find undeclared workers, we should move them into those jobs into declared employment. When we find businesses operating on an undeclared basis, cash in hand basis, we should transform them slowly into legitimate businesses. And that's the approach which is now adopted. And as I said, I work for the European Commission in a thing called the European Platform Tackling Undeclared Work. What that does is bring together member states, the 27 countries, and trade unions and employer federations to talk about how we can effectively and efficiently tackle the undeclared economy. So we exchange information, exchange good practices between countries. Countries learn from each other rather than reinvent the wheel. And we develop knowledge and evidence about how best to do it. And that, in one sentence, is what the European Platform Tackling Undeclared Work is about. And I apparently am the lead expert and advisor to it. So what's our approach? Our approach to tackling the undeclared economy is what we call a holistic approach. When it went through the European Parliament, the legislation to set up this European platform tackling undeclared work, the legislation said it requires a holistic approach. The legislation didn't tell us what that was. So the first task was to define what that means. And the definition is a whole government, cross-government approach, which joins up on the level of strategy and operations, the fields of labour, tax and social security law, and it involves social partners. What that means is tax authorities should not work in a silo on their own, nor should labour inspectorates, nor should social security institutions. They should work together with a common strategy. And we also said you should use the full range of policy measures available to enhance, improve the power of authorities and trust in authorities. And the objective, as I just said, is to transform undeclared work into declared work. So breaking that down into its components, you've got the objective. So we've moved away from eradicating undeclared work to transforming undeclared work into declared work. I suspect in Ukraine it's still to reduce undeclared work. Secondly, this cross-government coordinated approach, so get the tax authorities, the labour inspectorates, the social security institutions to develop a common strategy rather than their own individual strategies, to get them to join up their operations. No business wants the labour inspectorate coming one morning, the tax authority coming in the afternoon, the health and safety inspectorate coming the next morning, the fire authorities coming the next morning after that, and the social security authorities coming after that. So, you know, that's not business friendly. So join up their operations and work together. And also to cooperate on data mining, matching and sharing, because a lot of government ministries have their databases and they keep them very close to themselves and they never share that data with other ministries. If they put those databases together, then they can be a lot more effective, all of the authorities, in identifying businesses working on an illegitimate basis. And fourthly, improve the involvement of trade unions and employer federations. They've got a lot to offer. And then the third component is to use the full range of policy measures. I'm not going to talk about joining up governance today. I'm going to focus on this third component, using the full range of policy measures. So what do I mean by that? This is a summary of what I'm going to talk about. Conventionally, tax authorities, labour inspectorates, social security authorities used deterrence. They sought to increase the costs to people of being caught engaging in undeclared work. And the way they did that was to increase the fines and the risk of detection. That's great if you want to eradicate the undeclared economy. It's not good if you want to transform undeclared work into declared work. To transform it into the declared work, you also need incentives to encourage them to move into the declared economy. So there are also these preventative measures to prevent people operating undeclared, and also curative measures to cure people who are currently working undeclared and to help them and encourage them to move into the declared economy. So you can either increase the costs of undeclared work, the benefits of declared work, but that assumes people are rational actors, and they're not. And I will talk a little bit about these indirect controls, which recognise that people are not just rational economic actors who will respond to the costs and benefits confronting them, but they're also social animals, political animals. If they hate the state, they hate the government, they're not going to pay their taxes and pay their social contributions. So let's go through each of these approaches in turn. The direct policy approach, first of all, what I call a rational economic actor approach. What do I mean by that? Well, it dates back to the 1800s, a guy called Jeremy Bentham, who said, well, it's called classic utilitarian theory. And he said, if you change the costs confronting an individual so that you make the proceeds of crime less than the costs of crime, they will no longer engage in crime. So that's the basis. And what it argues is that people only engage in undeclared work when the perceived benefits of doing so outweigh the perceived costs. So it views the non-compliant as these rational economic actors, and what you have to do is deter them by making the costs outweigh the benefits. So for the past 40 years, 30 years, the focus has been on increasing the costs, detecting and punishing non-compliance. So, in other words, it's been based on sticks, not carrots. Negative reinforcement. Punish bad behaviour, don't reward good behaviour. So the policy approach has been to punish bad behaviour, not reward good behaviour. But we all know in other realms of life, spheres of life, that rewarding good behaviour is a lot more effective than punishing bad behaviour. Oksana has recently had a child. She will learn very quickly that rewarding the child's good behaviour is a lot more effective at changing their behaviour than punishing their bad behaviour. It's the same on undeclared work. But most authorities, state authorities, have sought to punish bad behaviour. The way in which they've done it, first of all, use penalties to increase the costs of undeclared work. And I've listed all sorts of sanctions governments use there. I should say there's no need to take notes. I sent to Oksana 2 minutes before this lecture started the PowerPoint presentation, and she can send it to you. So you can use penalties, fines to people who are caught working undeclared work. You can also put them on what used to be called blacklists, but that is actually a racist term. So I now refer to non-compliance lists rather than blacklists, because as well, undeclared work used to be called the black economy, compared with the white economy of the declared economy. Nice racist terms, which we now no longer use. So you can put people on a non-compliance list, and then if they're on that non-compliance list, you can stop them bidding for government contracts, or stop giving them access to subsidies. So if you find a farm which employs seasonal workers on an undeclared basis to pick their fruit, then you can then what you can do is not give them any subsidies in the future for their farming. That's the current debate in Europe, whether that should occur. You can also use naming and shaming lists. So publicise the people who have been caught. So there are different types of penalties. It's not just a monetary fine. You can fine people in other ways. Citizen activist organisation in Italy of young people, undergraduate students, in fact, from Bologna University. The translation would be shit employers. And what they do is they stand outside of shit employers who employ people on an undeclared basis, telling all of the customers going into those restaurants, cafes and bars about the employment in there. So citizens can do it as well. Use penalties. Besides penalties, you can increase the probability of detection. Most state authorities do that by doing a workplace inspection. So an inspector goes to a workplace and inspects it to make sure everyone working there is declared. You can do that as joint inspections, as I just said, with other inspectorates. You can do it as an unannounced inspection, or you can announce in advance there's going to be an inspection. I'll give you an example. In Greece, they announce in advance there's going to be an inspection, and they can actually watch on their employment register in the Ministry of Labour all of the employers from their iPhones registering their employees is registered in the hour before the inspectors arrive. It's a very cheap way of getting employees registered, to announce that you're going to inspect a street or an area. Use registration of workers prior to their first day at work. In a lot of countries that doesn't happen. An employer doesn't have to register a worker before their first day at work. very effective mechanism. You can use data mining, data matching to detect risky businesses. So if you see that a business has a turnover of €50,000 a year, a cafe, and only half an employee, then you might doubt that they're declaring all their employees. And you can take some averages. So you can look at the turnover of cafes and the average number of employees employed, and then look for what I call the outliers, the red flags, who are not within the norms. You can use complaint reporting tools, apps, telephone hotlines, so that people can report instances of abuse and undeclared work. You can use notification letters. You don't have to go and do a workplace inspection. If you identify a business is risky, you can just send it an email or a letter saying, we've noticed something is not quite right with your tax return and your registration of your employees. We're thinking of coming in doing an inspection in the next few months. We thought you should know. And it's really interesting how they legitimise very quickly when you send them these notification letters. That's called nudge. Nudge behaviour comes from behavioural economics, nudging people to do the right thing. You can use mandatory identity cards in the workplace. They're often called social ID cards. And supply chain responsibility. You can actually make the big firm at the top of the supply chain responsible for the businesses beneath it. It gets its supplies off. And if any of those businesses beneath it are found to be employing undeclared workers, then it's the big business at the top which gets fined. And it's amazing how that makes those businesses consider who they get their supplies off. But they're negative ones. You can also reward good behaviour, which most governments are only just starting to think about how you do that. So as to transform undeclared work into declared work, give them incentives to move into the declared economy. How do you do that? First of all, there are supply side incentives. That's for employers. You can simplify compliance. It's often really difficult to set up a business and to register employees, really difficult. And you see in a lot of countries, like there are about 30, 40, 50 steps you have to take to register a business, register employees. So you can simplify compliance, make registration of businesses and workers easy, simplify the forms, reduce duplication to different government ministries. In a lot of countries now, you can just enter from your phone into an app, a couple of words, and an employee is registered. You can use amnesties. You can say, yeah, if you've been working undeclared or your business has been working undeclared, you can come forward, declare this to us and say you want to be legitimate, and we will not penalise you. That's often also called voluntary disclosure. So it's a promise that you can come clean and say everything's okay, and there'll be no penalty attached to that. You can't use that too often when your government becomes ineffective. And lots of other things you can do as incentives. Provide advice on how to formalise. A lot of businesses working don't know how to formalise and want some help. So to hold their hand and provide them with advice. both existing businesses and startups. Provide free software for record keeping on expenses, turnover, fact sheets on how to do record keeping, free advice on record keeping, a gradual formalisation scheme so that you don't have to be legitimate the next morning after having your idea of a business, but you can formalise over time, over a period of time. They're very popular. And other initiatives, it's often very difficult to move from unemployment into self-employment because you have to continue claiming the benefits whilst you test trade your business to see if it's viable as a business. So you can do things, initiatives to ease that. That's supply side. But you can also focus on the customers, and you can encourage customers to buy declared goods and services. So in a lot of countries, if you use declared business to do home maintenance, home improvement, or for domestic cleaning, babysitting, elderly care, then what you can do is declare those costs, wages you've paid on your tax form, and then the government gives you 30% back. So that gives you an incentive to declare those workers you've employed. And therefore, once they're declared to the government, then the government knows who those self-employed workers are and how much money they've received. Another very useful one done in a lot of countries, and I like this, is a lottery. It's a lottery with receipts you get in shops. So let me take one step back. In a lot of countries, there were what are called black box cash registers introduced. So most shops have a cash register, which you type in the amount and then the customer gets a receipt. A black box cash register automatically sends the total number of transactions and the value of the transactions to the tax authority every day. So that's what the black box is on the cash register. Automatically sends it at the end of every day, the total value of the transactions which have gone through that cash register. But the trouble is that once it's compulsory for all businesses to have a cash register, they stop putting the transactions through the cash register. So you've got to have, you've got to give the customer a reason to ask for a receipt. And the reason here is that they can say, I want to win the lottery. And it's easy. The lottery ticket you get from a receipt is the date of the receipt, so the date of the transaction, and then the amount you paid. And that's your lottery number. So what are we today? 03 17 21, and let's say 1776. And that's my lottery number. And then every week the lottery's held, or every month, and you can win a lot of money. And it encourages customers to ask for receipts. I want to win the lottery. And it's very, very effective. In Romania, when it was introduced, the white paper, which is used for cash registers, there was a 10 times increase in the amount of paper sold for those receipts. So, and customers and the citizens love it, absolutely love it. So I've talked about costs, sticks to punish bad behaviour, carrots to reward good behaviour. And most government authorities now think that combining sticks and carrots is the most effective approach to tackle undeclared work. That's where most governments, where their heads are, where their minds are, where their strategy is. But there's also this second approach, social actor approach, I call it. And it transcends the idea that we are all these rational economic actors who will have perfect knowledge of the costs and benefits, and we will weigh them up in our heads and then decide whether to work undeclared or work declared. Because a lot of people don't choose to work undeclared for that basis. And a lot of employers don't decide to work undeclared for that basis. People are also a product of their social and political environment in which they exist. And when there's a breakdown of the social contract between the state and its citizens, Jean-Jacques Rousseau talked about the social contract, when there's a breakdown of the social contract between the state and its citizens, that's when you get non-compliance. What do I mean by that? In Ukraine at the moment, in the last few months, there have been a lot of media stories about the tax authority and about the corruption in the tax authority and the attempts to get rid of all of those senior figures in the tax authority and replace them with others. So when you perceive there is corruption in the state institutions, why would you pay your taxes? When you think that politicians take those taxes and put them in their own pockets, why would you pay your taxes? When you don't believe that you receive back from the state something which is equal to what you pay in, why would you pay your taxes? And it's very interesting because people often say that the way to get rid of the undeclared economy is to decrease taxes. Well, the undeclared economy is lowest in Sweden, Norway and Finland, which have the highest tax rates in the world. Why is that the case? It's because in Finland, Sweden and Norway, citizens believe that they receive lots of public goods and services back for the taxes they pay. So they see the health services, they see the quality of the schools, the universities, they see the quality of the roads in the public environment. So that's the social contract between the state and its citizens. We pay taxes, we get something back. And where that's broken, when that is broken, when you see corruption, when you think you see politicians putting the money in their own pockets, when you think the money is going somewhere else, you don't want to pay your taxes. So it's not a rational economic decision, it's a social and political decision. And let me explain this in terms of a theory. Since you're meant to be students receiving an academic education. It's called institutional theory. Institutions, what I mean by this is they're the rules of the game. Institutions are the rules of the game. They say what is acceptable to do and what is unacceptable to do. So we have rules of the game. All societies have rules of the game about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, just like a football match. And there are two sorts of rules of the game. There are formal rules of the game, the formal institutions, and the formal rules of the game are what we know as our laws and regulations. They describe the formal rules of the game. They describe state morality about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. That's what laws do. But all societies also have another set of rules of the game. And these are the informal rules of the game. These are what citizens, workers and employers believe is acceptable to do and not to do. And that describes civic morality. So we've got formal rules of the game, informal rules of the game. When they are the same as each other, you've got no problem. So when the informal rules of the game, civic morality about what is acceptable, is the same as state morality, our laws, no problems. The trouble is when they're not the same, when they're different. When you have what I call institutional asymmetry, differences. And undeclared work arises when the formal and informal rules are different. So to tackle undeclared work, what you need to do is to align together the formal and informal rules. And there are two ways of doing that. You can change the informal institutions, informal norms, beliefs and values about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, or you can change the formal rules of the game about what is acceptable and unacceptable. And this is what governments are now doing. They're changing the informal rules, and to change norms, values and beliefs of citizens, workers and employers, they engage in educational campaigns, awareness raising campaigns. They make these appeals to people's morality to try to change their values. And this is why you get all these marketing campaigns from government about why you should be paying your taxes. So they attempt to raise awareness and build trust. But also, nobody is going to change their attitudes about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable if they believe that tax authorities are corrupt, politicians are corrupt, and they don't believe that they will receive back good public goods and services, such as good schools, unemployment insurance, hospitals, health services, roads, etc. So you also need to change the formal institutions so as to build sincerity, consistency, trust, integrity for those formal institutions. You can do that in several ways. First of all, most enforcement authorities like tax authorities, labour inspectors, they're based on a cops and robbers approach at the moment. They believe that all citizens are criminals and their job is to catch them. And what it requires is a change in approach to a much more service-oriented approach and to see citizens as their customers. They're there to help. So you have to improve fairness so that people think they're treated with respect when they approach state institutions, that they believe that they get back the goods and services they deserve from government for the taxes they pay, and that they pay the appropriate amount for what they receive in return. So that's changing the formal institutions to make them much more customer friendly, customer orientated, which is a big ask in countries like Ukraine to ask the tax authorities to act like that. But also, undeclared work, as Friedrich Schneider would have told you last week, is also caused by a lot of macroeconomic structural conditions. So governments also, if they're going to reform themselves, need to deal with these. So They do need to improve the quality of their governance, reduce corruption. They do need to increase expenditure of government, have active labour market policies, greater social expenditure, reduce inequality in a society, etc., etc. So ultimately, to develop this symmetry between the formal and informal rules, you need to both change the formal institutions and engage in education and awareness raising. How am I doing for time, Oksana? Oh,
would you say that 5 minutes will be enough for you?
I'll finish. So what's happened is that all governments in Europe, those are not opposing approaches. They're approaches you can use both at the same time, and all governments use both at the same time. So they attempt to change values, norms and beliefs, change the formal institutions, increase the costs of undeclared work, increase the benefits of declared work. And there are two options. One is to start with the soft things like education awareness raising and just use penalties at the end, or which is that approach, or use them all at the same time to improve enforced compliance and voluntary compliance. Really quickly, I've used a traffic light system here so that you can see how common it is to use these different policy measures in the EU. And increase the costs of undeclared work. Green means lots and lots do it. Red means very few do it. Amber or yellow, a middle amount to it. Lots of green. Everybody uses measures to increase the costs of undeclared work. Very few provide incentives to help people move into the declared economy. And lots of countries are starting to use education and awareness campaigns. And I will finish it there so we've got lots of time for questions. So, conclusions. Current emphasis is on sticks, less emphasis on incentives. The propensity to engage in undeclared work is very strongly associated with tax morality, and we need to focus more upon that.